This sound file contains the spoken version of the Wikipedia article on Robert McNamara. The material was recorded on December 7th, 2017. Robert McNamara from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia at en.wikipedia.org. Robert Strange McNamara was an American business executive and the 8th Secretary of Defense, serving from 1961 to 1968 under Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. He played a major role in escalating the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. McNamara was responsible for the institution of systems analysis in public policy, which developed into the discipline known today as policy analysis. He was born in San Francisco, California, graduated from Harvard Business School, and served in the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. After the war, Henry Ford II hired McNamara and a group of other Army Air Force veterans to work for Ford Motor Company. These, quote, whiz kids, unquote, helped reform Ford with modern planning, organization, and management control systems. After briefly serving as Ford's president, McNamara accepted appointment as Secretary of Defense. McNamara became a close advisor to Kennedy and advocated the use of a blockade during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy and McNamara instituted a Cold War defense strategy of flexible response, which anticipated the need for military responses short of massive retaliation. McNamara consolidated intelligence and logistics functions of the Pentagon into two centralized agencies, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Defense Supply Agency. During the Kennedy administration, McNamara presided over a buildup in U.S. soldiers in South Vietnam. After the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, the number of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam escalated dramatically. McNamara and other U.S. policymakers feared that the fall of South Vietnam to a communist regime would lead to the fall of other governments in the region. McNamara grew increasingly skeptical of the efficacy of committing U.S. soldiers to Vietnam. In 1968, McNamara resigned as Secretary of Defense to become President of the World Bank. He remains the longest-serving Secretary of Defense, having remained in office over 7 years. He served as President of the World Bank until 1981, shifting the focus of the World Bank towards poverty reduction. After retiring, he served as a trustee of several organizations, including the California Institute of Technology and the Brookings Institution. Section 1. Early Life and Career. Robert McNamara was born in San Francisco, California. His father was Robert James McNamara, sales manager of a wholesale shoe company, and his mother was Clara Nell McNamara. His father's family was Irish, and in about 1850, following the Great Irish Famine, had emigrated to the U.S., first to Massachusetts and later to California. He graduated from Piedmont High School in Piedmont in 1933, where he was president of the Rigma Lions Boys Club, and earned the rank of Eagle Scout. McNamara attended the University of California, Berkeley, and graduated in 1937 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics with minors in mathematics and philosophy. He was a member of Phi Gamma Delta fraternity, was elected to Phi Beta Kappa his sophomore year, and earned a varsity letter in crew. McNamara was also a member of the UC Berkeley's Order of the Golden Bear, which was a fellowship of students and leading faculty members formed to promote leadership within the student body. He then attended Harvard Business School and earned an MBA in 1939. After business school, McNamara worked a year for the accounting firm Price Waterhouse in San Francisco, then returned to Harvard in August 1940 to teach accounting in the business school and became the highest paid and youngest assistant professor at the time. Following his involvement there in a program to teach analytical approaches used in business to officers of the United States Army Air Forces, he entered the United States Army Air Force as a captain in early 1943, serving most of World War II with its Office of Statistical Control. One of his major responsibilities was the analysis of U.S. bombers' efficiency and effectiveness, especially the B-29 forces commanded by Major General Curtis LeMay in India, China, and the Mariana Islands. McNamara established a statistical control unit for the XX Bomber Command and devised schedules for B-29s doubling as transports for carrying fuel and cargo over the hump. He left active duty in 1946 with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and with a Legion of Merit. Section 2. Ford Motor Company. In 1946, Charles Tex Thornton, a colonel under whom McNamara had served, put together a group of officers from his Army Air Force Statistical Control Operation to go into business together. Thornton had seen an article in Life magazine portraying Ford as being in dire need of reform. Henry Ford II, himself a World War II veteran from the Navy, hired the entire group of 10, including McNamara. The quote, whiz kids, unquote, as they came to be known, helped the money-losing company reform its chaotic administration through modern planning, organization, and management control systems. The origins of the phrase, quote, the whiz kids, unquote, can be explained as follows. Because of their youth, combined with asking lots of questions, Ford employees initially and despairingly refer to them as the, quote, quiz kids, unquote. The quiz kids rebranded themselves as the whiz kids. Starting as manager of planning and financial analysis, he advanced rapidly through a series of top-level management positions. McNamara was a force behind the Ford Falcon sedan, introduced in the fall of 1959, a small, simple, and inexpensive to produce counter to the large, expensive vehicles prominent in the late 1950s. McNamara placed a high emphasis on safety. The lifeguard options package introduced the seatbelt, a novelty at the time, and a dish steering wheel, which helped to prevent the driver from being impaled on the steering column. After the Lincoln Line's very large 1958, 1959, and 1960 models proved unpopular, McNamara pushed for smaller versions, such as the 1961 Lincoln Continental. On November 9, 1960, McNamara became the first president of Ford Motor Company from outside the Ford family. Section 3. Secretary of Defense. After his election in 1960, President-elect John F. Kennedy first offered the post of Secretary of Defense to former Secretary Robert A. Lovett. Lovett declined but recommended McNamara. Kennedy then sent Sergeant Shriver to approach him regarding either the Treasury or the Defense Cabinet post less than 5 weeks after McNamara had become president at Ford. McNamara immediately rejected the Treasury position, but eventually accepted Kennedy's invitation to serve as Secretary of Defense. According to Special Counsel Ted Sorensen, Kennedy regarded McNamara as the, quote, star of his team, calling upon him for advice on a wide range of issues beyond national security, including business and economic matters, unquote. McNamara became one of the few members of the Kennedy administration to work and socialize with Kennedy, and he became so close to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy that he served as a pallbearer at the younger Kennedy's funeral in 1968. McNamara's specialty was to statistically analyze the efficiency of fighting the protracted Vietnam War, including how to maximize the use of defoliants, bombs, and cannon. Initially, the basic policies outlined by President Kennedy in a message to Congress on March 28, 1961, guided McNamara in the reorientation of the defense program. Kennedy rejected the concept of first strike attack and emphasized the need for adequate strategic arms and defense to deter nuclear attack on the United States and its allies. U.S. arms, he maintained, must constantly be under civilian command and control, and the nation's defense posture had to be, quote, designed to reduce the danger of irrational or unpremeditated general war, unquote. The primary mission of U.S. overseas forces, in cooperation with allies, was, quote, to prevent the steady erosion of the free world through limited wars, unquote. Kennedy and McNamara rejected massive retaliation for a posture of flexible response. The U.S. wanted choices in an emergency other than, quote, inglorious retreat or unlimited retaliation, unquote, as the president put it. Out of a major review of the military challenges confronting the U.S. initiated by McNamara in 1961 came a decision to increase the nation's, quote, limited warfare, unquote, capabilities. These moves were significant because McNamara was abandoning President Dwight D. Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation in favor of a flexible response strategy that relied on increased U.S. capacity to conduct limited non-nuclear warfare. The Kennedy administration placed particular emphasis on improving ability to counter communist, quote, wars of national liberation, unquote, in which the enemy avoided head-on military confrontation and resorted to political subversion and guerrilla tactics. As McNamara said in his 1962 annual report, quote, the military tactics are those of the sniper, the ambush, and the raid. The political tactics are terror, extortion, and assassination, unquote. In practical terms, this meant training and equipping U.S. military personnel, as well as such allies as South Vietnam, for counterinsurgency operations. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, McNamara served as a member of XCOM and played a large role in the administration's handling and eventual defusing of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was a strong proponent of the blockade option over a missile strike and helped persuade the Joint Chiefs of Staff to agree with the blockade option. Increased attention to conventional strength complemented these special forces preparations. In this instance, he called up reserves and also proceeded to expand the regular armed forces, whereas active duty strength had declined from approximately 3,555,000 to 2,483,000 between 1953 and 1961. It increased to nearly 2,808,000 by June 30, 1962. Then the forces leveled off at around 2.7 million until the Vietnam military buildup began in 1965, reaching a peak of nearly 3,555,000 by mid-1968, just after McNamara left office. Nuclear strategy, trial doctrine. When McNamara took over the Pentagon in 1961, the United States military relied on all-out nuclear strike to respond to a Soviet attack of any kind. This kind of strike would lead to the death of Soviet military forces and also civilians. This was the same nuclear strategy planned by the Strategic Air Command led by General Curtis LeMay. McNamara did not agree with this kind of action. He sought for other options after seeing how this strategy could not guarantee the destruction of all Soviet nuclear weapons, leaving the United States vulnerable to retaliation. McNamara's alternative in the doctrine of counterforce was to try to limit the United States nuclear exchange by targeting only enemy military forces. This concept would also be used to prevent retaliation and escalation by holding Soviet cities hostage to a follow-up strike. McNamara later concluded that counterforce was not likely to control escalation, but likely to provoke retaliation. The U.S. nuclear policy remained the same. Other steps. McNamara took other steps to increase U.S. deterrence posture and military capabilities. He raised the proportion of Strategic Air Command strategic bombers on 15-minute ground alert from 25% to 50%, thus lessening their vulnerability to missile attack. In December 1961, he established the United States Strike Command. Authorized to draw forces when needed from the Strategic Army Corps, the Tactical Air Command, and the airlift units of the Military Air Transport Service and the Military Services, Strike Command had the mission, quote, to respond swiftly and with whatever force necessary to threats against the peace in any part of the world, reinforcing unified commands or carrying out separate contingency operations, unquote. McNamara also increased long-range airlift and sealift capabilities and funds for space research and development. After reviewing the separate and often uncoordinated service efforts in intelligence and communications, McNamara in 1961 consolidated these functions in the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Defense Communications Agency, having both report to the Secretary of Defense through the JCS. The end effect was to remove the intelligence function from the control of the military and to put it under the control of the Secretary of Defense. In the same year, he set up the Defense Supply Agency to work toward unified supply procurement, distribution, and inventory management under the control of the Secretary of Defense rather than the uniformed military. McNamara's institution of systems analysis as a basis for making key decisions on force requirements, weapon systems, and other matters occasioned much debate. Two of its main practitioners during the McNamara era, Elaine C. Enthoven and K. Wayne Smith, described the concept as follows. Quote, first, the word systems indicates that every decision should be considered in as broad a context as necessary. The word analysis emphasizes the need to reduce a complex problem to its component parts for better understanding. Systems analysis takes a complex problem and sorts out the tangle of significant factors so that each can be studied by the method most appropriate to it, unquote. Enthoven and Smith said they used mainly civilians as systems analysts because they could apply independent points of view to force planning. McNamara's tendency to take military advice into less account than had previous secretaries and to override military opinions contributed to his unpopularity with service leaders. It was also generally thought that systems analysis, rather than being objective, was tailored by the civilians to support decisions that McNamara had already made. The most notable example of systems analysis was the planning, programming, and budgeting system instituted by the United States Department of Defense Comptroller Charles J. Hitch. McNamara directed Hitch to analyze defense requirements systematically and produce a long-term, program-oriented defense budget. PBBS evolved to become the heart of the McNamara management program. According to Enthoven and Smith, the basic ideas of PBBS were, quote, the attempt to put defense program issues into a broader context and to search for explicit measures of national need and adequacy, unquote. Quote, consideration of military needs and costs together, unquote. Quote, explicit consideration of alternatives at the top decision level, unquote. quote, the active use of an analytical staff at the top policy-making levels, unquote. Quote, a plan combining both forces and costs which projected into the future the foreseeable implications of current decisions, unquote, and, quote, open and explicit analysis, that is, each analysis should be made available to all interested parties, so that they can examine the calculations, data, and assumptions, and retrace the steps leading to the conclusions, unquote. In practice, the data produced by the analysis was so large and so complex that while it was available to all interested parties, none of them could challenge the conclusions. Among the management tools developed to implement PBBS were the 5-year defense plan, the draft presidential memorandum, the readiness information and control tables, and the development concept paper. The annual FYDP was a series of tables projecting forces for 8 years and costs and manpower for 5 years in mission-oriented rather than individual service programs. By 1968, the FYDP covered 10 military areas: strategic forces, general-purpose forces, intelligence and communications, airlift and sealift, guard and reserve forces, research and development, central supply and maintenance, training and medical services, administration and related activities, and support of other nations. The draft presidential memorandum, intended for the White House and usually prepared by the Systems Analysis Office, was a method to study and analyze major defense issues. 16 DPMs appeared between 1961 and 1968 on such topics as strategic offensive and defense forces, NATO strategy and force structure, military assistance, and tactical air forces. OSD sent the DPMs to the services and the Joint Chief of Staff for comment and making decisions. McNamara included in the DPM a statement of alternative approaches, force levels, and other factors. The DPM in its final form became a decision document. The DPM was hated by the JCS and uniformed military in that it cut their ability to communicate directly to the White House. The DPMs were also disliked because the systems analysis process was so heavyweight that it was impossible for any service to effectively challenge its conclusions. The development concept paper examined performance, schedule, cost estimates, and technical risks to provide a basis for determining whether to begin or continue a research and development program. But in practice, what it proved to be was a cost burden that became a barrier to entry for companies attempting to deal with the military. It aided the trend toward a few large, non-competitive defense contractors serving the military. Rather than serving any useful purpose, the overhead necessary to generate information that was often in practice ignored resulted in increased costs throughout the system. The readiness information and control tables provided data on specific projects, more detailed than in the FYDP, such as the tables for the Southeast Asia Deployment Plan, which recorded by month and quarter the schedule for deployment, consumption rates, and future projections of U.S. forces in Southeast Asia. ABM. Toward the end of his term, McNamara also opposed an anti-ballistic missile system proposed for installation in the U.S. in defense against Soviet missiles, arguing the $40 billion, quote, in itself is not the problem, the penetrability of the proposed shield is the problem, unquote. Under pressure to proceed with the ABM program after it became clear that the Soviets had begun a similar project, McNamara finally agreed to a, quote, light, unquote, system which he believed could protect against the far smaller number of Chinese missiles. However, he never believed it was wise for the United States to move in that direction because of psychological risks of relying too much on nuclear weaponry, and that there would be pressure from many directions to build a larger system than would be militarily effective. He always believed that the best defense strategy for the U.S. was a parity of mutually assured destruction with the Soviet Union. An ABM system would be an ineffective weapon as compared to an increase in deployed nuclear missile capacity. Cost reductions. McNamara's staff stressed systems analysis as an aid in decision-making on weapon development and many other budget issues. The Secretary believed that the United States could afford any amount needed for national security, but that, quote, this ability does not excuse us from applying strict standards of effectiveness and efficiency to the way we spend our defense dollars. You have to make a judgment on how much is enough, unquote. Acting on these principles, McNamara instituted a much-publicized cost reduction program, which he reported saved $14 billion in the 5-year period beginning in 1961. Although he had to withstand a storm of criticism from senators and representatives from affected congressional districts, he closed many military bases and installations that he judged unnecessary to national security. He was equally determined about other cost-saving measures. Due to the nuclear arms race, the Vietnam War buildup, and other projects, total obligation authority increased greatly during the McNamara years. Fiscal year TOA increased from $48.4 billion in 1962 to $49.5 billion in 1965 to $74.9 billion in 1968, McNamara's last year in office. Not until fiscal year 1984 did the Department of Defense's total obligational authority surpass that of fiscal year 1968 in constant dollars. Program consolidation. One major hallmark of McNamara's cost reductions was the consolidation of programs from different services, most visibly an aircraft acquisition, believing that the redundancy created waste and unnecessary spending. McNamara directed the Air Force to adopt the Navy's F-4 Phantom and A-7 Corsair combat aircraft, a consolidation that was quite successful. Conversely, his actions in mandating a premature across-the-board adoption of the untested M16 rifle proved catastrophic when the weapons began to fail in combat. McNamara tried to extend his success by merging development programs as well, resulting in the TFX dual-service F-111 project. It was to combine Navy requirements for a fleet air defense aircraft and Air Force requirements for a tactical bomber. His experience in the corporate world led him to believe that adopting a single type for different missions and service would save money. He insisted on the General Dynamics entry over the DoD's preference for Boeing because of commonality issues. Though heralded as a fighter that could do everything, fast supersonic dash, slow carrier and short airfield landings, tactical strike, and even close air support, in the end it involved too many compromises to succeed at any of them. The Navy version was drastically overweight and difficult to land, and eventually canceled after a Grumman study showed it was incapable of matching the abilities of the newly revealed Soviet MiG-23 and MiG-25 aircraft. The F-111 would eventually find its niche as a tactical bomber and electronic warfare aircraft with the Air Force. However, many analysts believe that even though the TFX project itself was a failure, McNamara was ahead of his time as the trend in fighter design has continued toward consolidation. The F-16 Falcon and F-18 Hornet emerged as multi-role fighters, and most modern designs combine many of the roles the TFX would have had. In many ways, the Joint Strike Fighter is seen as a rebirth of the TFX project, in that it purports to satisfy the needs of three American air arms, fulfilling the roles of carrier-launched fighter, VSTOL, and close air support. Vietnam War. During President John F. Kennedy's term, while McNamara was Secretary of Defense, America's troops in Vietnam increased from 900 to 16,000 advisors, who were not supposed to engage in combat, but rather to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The number of combat advisors in Vietnam when Kennedy died varies depending on the source. The first military advisor deaths in Vietnam occurred in 1957 or 1959 under the Eisenhower administration, which had infiltrated Vietnam through the efforts of Stanley Scheinbaum with an unknown number of CIA operatives and other special forces, in addition to almost 700 advisors. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations had committed the United States to support the French and native anti-communist forces in Vietnam in resisting efforts by the communists in the North to unify the country, though neither administration established actual combat forces in the war. The U.S. role, initially limited to financial support, military advice, and covert intelligence gathering, expanded after 1954 when the French withdrew. During the Kennedy administration, the U.S. military advisory group in South Vietnam steadily increased, with McNamara's concurrence from 900 to 16,000. U.S. involvement escalated after the Gulf of Tonkin incidents in August 1964, involving two purported attacks on a U.S. Navy destroyer by North Vietnamese naval vessels. Records from the Lyndon Johnson Library have perhaps indicated that McNamara misled Johnson on the attack on a U.S. Navy destroyer by allegedly withholding calls against executing airstrikes from U.S. Pacific commanders. McNamara was also instrumental in presenting the event to Congress and the public as justification for escalation of the war against the communists. In 1995, McNamara met with former North Vietnamese Minister Vo Nguyen Giap, who told his American counterpart that the August 4th attack never happened, a conclusion McNamara eventually came to accept. President Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes on North Vietnamese naval bases. Congress approved, with only Senators Wayne Morse and Ernest Gruning voting against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, authorizing the president, quote, to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the U.S. and to prevent further aggression," unquote. Regardless of the particulars of the incident, the larger issue would turn out to be the sweeping powers granted by the resolution. It gave Johnson virtually unfettered authority to expand retaliation for a relatively minor naval incident into a major land war involving 500,000 American soldiers. Quote, "The fundamental issue of Tonkin Gulf involved not deception, but rather misuse of power bestowed by the resolution," unquote, McNamara wrote later. In 1965, in response to stepped-up military activity by the Viet Cong in South Vietnam and their North Vietnamese allies, the U.S. began bombing North Vietnam, deployed large military forces, and entered into combat in South Vietnam. McNamara's plan, supported by requests from top U.S. military commanders in Vietnam, led to the commitment of 485,000 troops by the end of 1967, and put 535,000 by June 30, 1968. The casualty lists mounted as the number of troops and the intensity of fighting escalated. McNamara put in place a statistical strategy for victory in Vietnam. He concluded that there were a limited number of Viet Cong fighters in Vietnam, and that a war of attrition would destroy them. He applied metrics, or body counts, to determine how close to success his plan was. Although he was a prime architect of the Vietnam War and repeatedly overruled the Joint Chiefs of Staff on strategic matters, McNamara gradually became skeptical about whether the war could be won by deploying more troops to South Vietnam and intensifying the bombing of North Vietnam, a claim he would publish in a book years later. He also stated later that his support of the Vietnam War was given out of loyalty to administration policy. He traveled to Vietnam many times to study the situation firsthand and became increasingly reluctant to approve the large force increments requested by the military commanders. McNamara said that the domino theory was the main reason for entering the Vietnam War. In the same interview, he stated, quote, "Kennedy hadn't said before he died whether, faced with the loss of Vietnam, he would completely withdraw, but I believe today that had he faced that choice, he would have withdrawn," unquote. Social equity. To commemorate President Harry S. Truman's signing an order to end segregation in the military, McNamara issued Directive 5120.36 on July 26, 1963. This directive, Equal Opportunity in the Armed Forces, dealt directly with the issue of racial and gender discrimination in areas surrounding military communities. The directive declared, quote, "Every military commander has the responsibility to oppose discriminatory practices affecting his men and their dependents and to foster equal opportunity for them, not only in areas under his immediate control, but also in nearby communities where they may live or gather in off-duty hours," unquote. Under the directive, commanding officers were obligated to use the economic power of the military to influence local businesses in their treatment of minorities and women. With the approval of the Secretary of Defense, the commanding officer could declare areas off-limits to military personnel for discriminatory practices. Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was between the United States and the Soviet Union, lasting for 13 days in October 1962. During this time, Robert McNamara was serving as Secretary of Defense and one of John F. Kennedy's trusted advisors. When Kennedy received confirmation of the placement of offensive Soviet missiles in Cuba, he immediately set up the Executive Committee, referred to as EXCOM. This committee included United States government officials, including Robert McNamara, to advise Kennedy on the crisis. Kennedy instructed EXCOM to immediately come up with a response to the Soviet threat unanimously without him present. During this time, it was confirmed the crisis had to be resolved within 48 hours by receiving two messages from Nikita Khrushchev. The first message, an informal one, stated if the United States guaranteed to not invade Cuba, then they would take the missiles out. The second message, a more formal one, was broadcast on the radio, stating if the United States attacked, then Cuba was prepared to retaliate with masses of military power. Although American defense planning focused on using nuclear weapons, Kennedy and McNamara saw it was clear the use of strategic weapons could be suicidal. On Tuesday, October 16th, EXCOM had their first meeting. The majority of officials favored an air attack on Cuba in hopes to destroy the missile sites. Although the vote was not unanimous, which brought them to other alternatives. By the end of the week, EXCOM came up with 4 different alternative strategies to present the president: a blockade, an airstrike, an invasion, or some combination of these. These military actions are known as O-Plan 312, O-Plan 314, and O-Plan 316. A quarantine was a way to prevent the Soviets from bringing any military equipment in or out of Cuba. During the final review of both alternatives on Sunday, October 21st, upon Kennedy's request, McNamara presented the argument against the attack and for the quarantine. On Wednesday, October 24th at 10 a.m. EDT, the quarantine line around Cuba went into effect. Following Cuba's aftermath, McNamara stated, quote, "There is no such thing as strategy, only crisis management," unquote. Departure. McNamara wrote of his close personal friendship with Jackie Kennedy and how she demanded that he stop killing in Vietnam. As McNamara grew more and more controversial after 1966, and his differences with the President and the Joint Chiefs of Staff over Vietnam strategy became the subject of public speculation, frequent rumors surfaced that he would leave office. In an early November 1967 memorandum to Johnson, McNamara's recommendation to freeze troop levels, stop bombing North Vietnam, and for the U.S. to hand over ground fighting to South Vietnam was rejected outright by the President. McNamara's recommendations amounted to his saying that the strategy of the United States in Vietnam, which had been pursued to date, had failed. McNamara later stated he, quote, "never heard back," unquote, from Johnson regarding the memo. Largely as a result, on November 29th of that year, McNamara announced his pending resignation and that he would become president of the World Bank. Other factors were the increasing intensity of the anti-war movement in the U.S., the approaching presidential campaign in which Johnson was expected to seek re-election, and McNamara's support over the objections of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of construction along the 17th parallel separating South and North Vietnam of a line of fortifications running from the coast of Vietnam into Laos. The President's announcement of McNamara's move to the World Bank stressed his stated interest in the job and that he deserved a change after 7 years as Secretary of Defense, longer than any of his predecessors or successors. Others give a different view of McNamara's departure from office. For example, Stanley Carnow, in his book Vietnam, A History, strongly suggests that McNamara was asked to leave by the President. McNamara himself expressed uncertainty about the question. McNamara left office on February 29, 1968. For his efforts, the President awarded him both the Medal of Freedom and the Distinguished Service Medal. Shortly after McNamara departed the Pentagon, he published The Essence of Security, discussing various aspects of his tenure and position on basic national security issues. He did not speak out again on defense issues or Vietnam until after he left the World Bank. Section 4. World Bank President. Robert McNamara served as head of the World Bank from April 1968 to June 1981, when he turned 65. In his 13 years at the bank, he introduced key changes, most notably shifting the bank's focus toward targeted poverty reduction. He negotiated, with the conflicting countries represented on the board, a growth in funds to channel credits for development in the form of health, food, and education projects. He also instituted new methods of evaluating the effectiveness of funded projects. One notable project started during McNamara's tenure was the effort to prevent river blindness. Reportedly, McNamara first heard about his appointment as president of the World Bank through a press leak. The World Bank currently has a scholarship program under his name. As World Bank president, he declared at the 1968 annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group that countries permitting birth control practices would get preferential access to resources. Section 5. Post-World Bank Activities and Assessments. In 1982, McNamara joined several other former national security officials in urging that the United States pledge not to use nuclear weapons first in Europe in the event of hostilities. Subsequently, he proposed the elimination of nuclear weapons as an element of NATO's defense posture. In 1993, Washington journalist Deborah Shapley published a 1,615-page biography of Robert McNamara entitled Promise and Power: The Life and Times of Robert McNamara. Shapley concluded her book with these words, quote, "For better and worse, McNamara shaped much in today's world and imprisoned himself. A little-known 19th century writer, F.W. Boreham, offers a summation. We make our decisions, and then our decisions turn around and make us," unquote. McNamara's memoir, In Retrospect, published in 1995, represented an account and analysis of the Vietnam War from his point of view. According to his lengthy New York Times obituary, quote, "He concluded well before leaving the Pentagon that the war was futile, but he did not share that insight with the public until late in life. In 1995, he took a stand against his own conduct of the war, confessing in a memoir that it was wrong, terribly wrong," unquote. In return, he faced a, quote, firestorm of scorn, unquote, at that time. The Fog of War, 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara, is a 2003 Errol Morris documentary consisting mostly of interviews with Robert McNamara and archival footage. It went on to win the Academy Award for Documentary Feature. The particular structure of this personal account is accomplished with the characteristics of an intimate dialogue. As McNamara explains, it is a process of examining the experiences of his long and controversial period as the United States Secretary of Defense, as well as other periods of his personal and public life. McNamara maintained his involvement in politics in his later years, delivering statements critical of the Bush administration's 2003 invasion of Iraq. On January 5, 2006, McNamara and most living former Secretaries of Defense and Secretaries of State met briefly at the White House with President Bush to discuss the war. McNamara has been portrayed or fictionalized in several films, and in at least one video game. Simon and Garfunkel's 1966 album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, contained a song entitled, quote, A Simple Desultory Philippic, or How I Was Robert McNamara'd into Submission, unquote. Section 7. Personal Life. McNamara married Margaret Craig, his teenage sweetheart, on August 13, 1940. She was an accomplished cook, and Robert's favorite dish was reputed to be her beef bourguignon. Margaret McNamara, a former teacher, used her position as a cabinet spouse to launch a reading program for young children, Reading is Fundamental, which became the largest literacy program in the country. She died of cancer in 1981. The couple had 2 daughters and a son. The son, Robert Craig McNamara, who as a student objected to the Vietnam War, is now a walnut and grape farmer in California. He is the owner of Sierra Orchards in Winters, California. Daughter Kathleen McNamara Spears is a forester with the World Bank. The second daughter is Margaret Elizabeth Pastor. In the Errol Morris documentary, McNamara reports that both he and his wife were stricken with polio shortly after the end of World War II. Although McNamara had a relatively short stay in the hospital, his wife's case was much more serious, and it was concern over meeting her medical bills that led to his decision to not return to Harvard, but to enter private industry as a consultant at Ford Motor Company. When working at Ford Motor Company, McNamara resided in Ann Arbor, Michigan, rather than the usual auto executive domains of Grosse Pointe, Birmingham, and Bloomfield Hills. He and his wife sought to remain connected with a university town, after their hopes of returning to Harvard after the war were put on hold. In 1961, he was named Alumnus of the Year by the University of California, Berkeley. On September 29, 1972, a passenger on the ferry to Martha's Vineyard recognized McNamara on board and attempted to throw him into the ocean. McNamara declined to press charges. The man remained anonymous, but was interviewed years later by author Paul Hendrickson, who quoted the attacker as saying, quote, I just wanted to confront McNamara on Vietnam, unquote. After his wife's death, McNamara dated Katharine Graham, with whom he had been friends since the early 1960s. Graham died in 2001. In September 2004, McNamara wed Diana Masiri Byfield, an Italian-born widow who had lived in the United States for more than 40 years. It was her second marriage. She was married for more than 3 decades to Ernest Byfield, a former OSS officer and Chicago hotelier whose mother, Gladys Tartier, leased her 400-acre Glen Ora estate in Middleburg, Virginia, to John F. Kennedy during his presidency. At the end of his life, McNamara was a life trustee on the Board of Trustees of the California Institute of Technology, a trustee of the Economists for Peace and Security, a trustee of the American University of Nigeria, and an honorary trustee for the Brookings Institution. McNamara died in his sleep at his home in Washington, D.C. early in the morning at 5:30 a.m. on July 6, 2009 at the age of 93. He is buried at the Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia. McNamara's papers from his year as Secretary of Defense are housed in the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. This sound file and all text in the article are licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 Unported License, available at http://creativecommons.org/licenses/by-sa/3.0.